Studies are how I improve the most at landscape painting. Today I wanted to show you how I do landscape studies from photo reference. Without further ado, let's get started. One of the types of studies I like to do are something called value studies. So what are value studies? Well, let's start with saying what values are. Values are the groupings of light and dark, and it assigns how bright something is and how dark something is. So it's a grayscale spectrum. You break things down into value groupings, and each value can have their own values inside of them. And usually you start with bigger ones and you work your way down to smaller ones. So let's just do a couple examples. Usually things get darker the closer they are to the viewer. That also adds some depth to it. So see, that looks like a full value range. But they can be even more dramatic. See how much darker that is next to those? And it doesn't even look that dark compared to the darkest. That was even the lighter section of the medium. So what if we drew this medium right here? See, like way darker. And this is even darker. So even this middle one probably is a pretty good range to start with. And it varies on the context of what you're looking at. Skies generally are brighter, and the grounds tend to be darker. And then certain things have a different darkness to them, like some trees look way darker than the grass could look, for example. But some trees can look brighter than the ground. It just depends on the context of what you're looking at. So I'm going to do a study where I break down my ranges. Alright, let's start this value study. So I went in and blocked in roughly the values I thought things were at. And I'm just kind of guessing where things are. And usually things tend to be lighter in the background and darker in the foreground. But not always, because you can see the grass there is brighter than the background just because the sun's shining directly on it. And the main utility of doing value studies is it helps you figure out how to break down more complex shapes into simplified forms. And it makes it way easier to understand your subject that you're looking at. If you just start doing the details right from the beginning, you're going to get lost and everything's going to look all odd and wonky. So this is just a good exercise to do, even if you are experienced, just to come back and get you rooted in the thought process of breaking things down by shapes. And you do that same thing in color, but color just adds a whole nother layer of complexity to it. And we'll get to that later. But for now, this study's coming along. I like it so far. I was having a hard time on the left side of the study because it was not quite the same values, but it was in the approximately the right range, so I kept it there until I decided I was going to start adding more values to it. But usually I try and keep them close to their similar area. Sometimes there's just going to be random white spots where the snow is, or the clouds. And I end up going back and redoing the sky. This is all sped up about, I think it was about 20 times sped up. So this isn't real time. I think it took me about 15-20 minutes on this study. Now I redid the sky because I thought it was way too dark. And now we can see the difference, the contrast between the sky and the ground, which makes it way more readable. I'm starting to do the smaller details, or the smaller shapes, as I work my way through this study. And that's generally a good process to go through. Here is where Photoshop crashed, and I had to go and use the snipping tool of my recording to get it back. So then I ended up with a different reference photo, which is close enough to the same thing, but I decided I was going to call it done early just because I didn't have the correct reference, so things weren't things weren't looking quite right, and I just needed to get everything together. And that's pretty much how my study ended, and let's move on to another one. Let's do another study. Alright, this one I did a little quicker. I really liked how the values were easier to read in this one. You could kind of separate the values with the ridge lines. It got a little harder to read in the foreground, but I really liked how it looked, and I think this would be a good beginner level type study to do. And the clouds are cool. I really like the overcast look to it. Much more darker than I would have what I was doing. I think I just like it. Not really much to say on this one as much. Just want to do another quick example one. Let's move on to a color study. Hey, one quick thing before I get into this study, I kind of want to show you basically how the colors work. So you have the value, we already figured that out. And then you have the hue, which is like the exact color of it. And then saturation is the intensity. And what I'm doing is I'm just using my best guess as sliding these around to see where I am in the color. And occasionally I can check it to see how far off I am. See, a little more lighter. I was a little brighter. Now I was a little darker. And a little, no, the saturation was pretty right. The hue slid over towards the cyan a bit more. A little lighter, and that's pretty close to that. Still, you can draw right next to it to check it. But that's what I'm going to do with this study. I just wanted to let you know what adjustments I was making while I was doing the study, because it didn't show that well in the time lapse. But without further ado, let's get into the study. So now I'm going to do a color study, which is basically the same as value studies, but with color, and that's a whole nother thing you got to keep in mind. And for most of the colors in the beginning, I kind of try and manually select them is my best guess on where they are. I did brighten up some of the colors because I felt like this reference was a little dark. I kind of figure out colors. I sometimes select a color and then adjust it from there to get kind of in the right area of the other colors. And you gotta keep in mind when you're doing photo studies, they don't have to be exactly one for one. Just try and copy it the best you can. I think with master studies, it's good to try and do one for one because you learn a lot more. But that's not what we're doing right now. We're just doing photo studies, mostly mountains. And now I'm going in adding some variants in the color. Kind of adjust how it doesn't show the color bar in this recording. But what I'm doing is I'm sliding the colors. I'm sliding the saturation, I'm sliding the hue. The value, not so much unless I'm trying to just change the color up a little bit. Give it some variance in it. Make it look not flat. Because that's a problem you can have be very flat if you just use one color to describe a certain area. Sometimes it works. Like in the background, you don't need that as much. So mid and foreground tends to be more where you do it. So now what I'm doing here is I'm doing something called an applied study. So I apply all the stuff I learned from that painting into original composition. And you could do thumbnails to kind of figure out a better one, and I kind of just winged it here. And I'm not using a hard round brush anymore. I'm using very various brushes. I'm using a lot of brushes from Kyle Webster's Mega Pack, which I think you can get on Adobe's website. You can't get for any other software, so that's something to note. And I really like his oil canvas brushes, because you get that texture of having it on a canvas. Not all of them come out that way, but they just like that. And the brushes you use for studies doesn't really matter, as long as you're capturing the values and the colors to mostly accurate. Now I turned it off for a little bit to kind of work on it without the reference of my own study. So I'm using my own study as a reference for this painting. I think I have the other original reference off screen. And something cool about applied studies, you can turn them into like full original compositions and paintings. And you get a project out of it, and you get to apply what you learned, and it just makes it way better of an experience when you have something at the end of the day that you created. So doing studies are awesome. I think I might do some more study videos where I do different types of subjects. This was mostly mountains, but I think I'll maybe do like clouds or rocks or trees. I could definitely do trees, because I did a bunch of tree studies a few months ago in my 100 tree video, if you want to go check that out. But now I think I completely get rid of the reference and I just start painting it as my own thing. There's always more that I see that I can do every time, but I got to a point where I felt like it was good enough to be done. And I went back in and kind of messed around and added some more details in and whatnot. Like I went and tried to add some like grassy details in the foreground, some rocks, which I think they came out pretty cool. And anyways, that's the basics of basically how I do my studies. It's not very in-depth. Maybe I'll do that sometime down the road. I just wanted to kind of share with you guys how I learn and how I rough out things and study. The real learning is when you do the applied studies. But let me know if you have any particular type of subject you want me to cover, and maybe I'll do a video on them. And until next time, Dargon out.